Okay. Good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for having me. I'm a bit of a walker. I hope that's okay. I'm going to move from side to side here. I want to let you know that I'm very grateful and honored to be here today. I have never been to New Orleans before. I think I'm getting a little feedback, so I'm going to... Okay, we'll turn that one off. I have never been to New Orleans before. I was in Baton Rouge once, but I've never been to New Orleans before. But it doesn't mean I don't have a connection to New Orleans. I was a federal prosecutor for 20 years, and in that time I prosecuted basically every kind of case you can imagine, including a case where the last time the Detroit Lions made the playoffs was, I think it was 2016, I'm not really sure when it was, but we played your New Orleans Saints here in New Orleans, and it didn't go great for us. As Lions fans, almost nothing ever goes great for us. And at halftime, I think we were down about 20 points. And a man from outside Detroit lobbed a phone call. That phone call was to the Louisiana Superdome, as I knew it growing up. I forget what it's called now. Down there, and he somehow got into the switchboard or to whoever's running there, and he said, if you don't tell those boys to slow down, I'm going to plant a bomb. And he made a bomb threat. It was a very long, lengthy bomb threat to the Louisiana Superdome because the Lions were doing so poorly. So that is my connection. I prosecuted that man, so you're welcome. I think what he did was wrong, but I was with him in spirit in some ways, okay? So I do have a very small connection to New Orleans. But I am grateful to be here, and I'm grateful to learn more about Hope House. But I have a really sort of narrow role today. So I think Thomas did a fantastic job of explaining Hope House to you. Some of these pictures and this button bowl is just fantastic. And I think some of that imagery that you see is so important, and I would encourage you to get more involved if you aren't already in Hope House. But my job today is to not necessarily tell you what Hope House can do for our kiddos. I think that was done very well before me. But instead, my role this morning is to help you understand what it's like for those 445 kids who have to pull the door handle to Hope House for the very first time. What is it like to be one of those kiddos? And so to do that, I'm going to have to take you back through pieces of my childhood. But what I want you to know at the sort of outset of all of this is what I'm going to tell you this morning is not a unique story, sadly. I always like to tell people what's so remarkable about what happened to me is how unremarkable it is. In every community in this country, including yours and including mine, there are kiddos who are being manipulated like I was manipulated, lied to like I was lied to, and sexually abused like I was sexually abused. This collection of buttons here represents a story just like mine. But my hope today is that you will have maybe a better understanding of what it's like to be one of those kiddos. And so every story of childhood sexual abuse has a series of facts or ingredients that when they sort of come together and then you insert into that story someone with a sexual interest in children, bad things happen for our kiddos. These aren't the causes of childhood sexual abuse. In other words, if sort of fact 1 and fact 2 and fact 3 all came together, a kid would get hurt, well, we would just never let those 3 facts come together, right? But it's true that every story of child abuse does have certain facts that set up a sort of perfect storm for our kids to get hurt when they encounter someone with a sexual interest in children. And so for my story, there are 3 things that I'd highlight for you. Are the geography of where I grew up, my family dynamics, and then my own little idiosyncrasies. So first, let me tell you about geography. I am from Livonia, Michigan. You have been there, even if you haven't. It is like every suburb of every big city in this country. It is strip mall, school, neighborhood, church, wash, rinse, repeat. Over and over and over. It's a nothing town. In fact, if I dropped you in the middle of Livonia, Michigan, you would find the Chili's like that. You'd have no problem. It would be totally intuitive to you. It is a nothing suburb. But from a geography standpoint, a couple things were sort of meaningful for what happened to me. The first is it was a pretty big suburb. In fact, in the 1980s, the time frame we're talking about here, it had over 100,000 people, which made us the 6th biggest city in the state of Michigan at the time. We also were a very safe suburb. In fact, of towns in the United States with 100,000 people, at that time, Livonia, Michigan had the lowest crime rate in the whole country. I literally lived in the safest suburb in America. But in this sort of otherwise nothing suburb, I lived in a nothing neighborhood on a nothing street. I lived halfway down my street, one of these 25-mile-an-hour roads. But the geography that's really important here is that I would walk outside my front door, I would cross my little street, I would then go through my neighbor's yard, and it opened up into a big field, and that field was attached to a middle school. And that field is where I learned to play soccer. Ever since I could walk, that was the sport that I loved. And it was so close, I was so close, you could probably throw a rock from my front porch and it would land in that field. So to take me to soccer practice, if I were to drive with my parents and drive all the way up my street into the main street, would take about twice as long as simply walking across the street. Now that geography is important. That geography is important because when you intersect that with my family dynamics, I'm the youngest of 4 kids. As I like to think of it, my parents just kept making humans until they got one right. Maybe if you met my siblings, you'd understand. But because I was the youngest of 4, and because I lived so close, I had a lot of freedom, right? I think we can all appreciate that we parent slightly different with each iteration of child. No judgment here. I'm the father of 3 kids. When my oldest, Rose, when she was born and she had a pacifier, right, as a baby and she'd spit it out, I would hurry to grab it and I would run it under hot water and I would dip it in boiling water and I would pray over it and I would allow it to enter her mouth, right? And then when my youngest, whose name is Raleigh, when he would spit out his pacifier, I would first stop and give him a side eye to let him know how disappointed I am in him. And then I would sort of kind of dip it over once or twice on the ground to get enough dirt so that when I put it back in his mouth, he had something to hold on to so he wouldn't spit it out so I wouldn't have to pick it up again, right? So I completely understand how we parent different, but because I was the youngest of 4, I would walk across the street alone to soccer practice for as long as I can remember. The other thing that was happening in my family at that time was my parents were going through a divorce. I didn't know that. I didn't know what a divorce was. We didn't know people who were divorced, but I knew there was a lot of tension and stress at home. We weren't much of a family at that point. So you couple those things with my own little idiosyncrasies, which was that I was a sensitive little guy. By the time I was 9 years old, I was a sensitive little guy, and I'm also the son of a hockey coach. You're going to hear a lot about by the way, sorry, real quick. So hockey is a game. It's played on a sheet of ice. You know what? We're just going to go with, forget, just trust me when I say he was a coach. So as a result of that, I always wanted to be someone who was a good teammate and good to my teachers, my coaches, things like that. So you combine all those facts together. I walk across the street to go to my first practice as a 9-year-old, and I meet Randy Robbins. My first, it was my soccer coach, never met him before. And I meet him, and I liked him immediately. He was very different than any other coach I had ever had. He was different in a lot of ways, some perhaps troubling. So for example, Randy was unlike, Randy didn't seem to know a lot about the game of soccer. It wasn't a strength of his. Didn't have a full command on the rules, certainly not of the strategy. But he was also different because he wasn't related to anyone on our team. So every coach I had ever had was some kid's dad or brother or uncle or maybe a neighbor, or they worked for the local YMCA, which is where the leagues that I always played on was through the YMCA. But Randy was different. He didn't know anyone on the team. He didn't work for the YMCA. He was just a 26-year-old guy that liked hanging around with 9-year-old boys. What could go wrong, right? But he was different in a way that was more meaningful to me at that time, which was that he wasn't much of a yeller as a coach. He didn't holler at us and try to, I don't know, maybe because he didn't know a lot of strategy, he wasn't real focused on drills. Instead, what we would do is we'd just sort of show up to practice. Most times he'd just roll the ball out, split the boys up, and we'd play a scrimmage. And he would sort of play along with us, and he'd often pull us aside and talk to us about our life. And so instead of sort of focusing on us as soccer players, he seemed more focused on us as people. Talk about our family, our school, our friends, that kind of thing. And in that way, I really liked him. He was very different, very personable. And it didn't take long for me to learn that Randy took a liking to me as well. And after just a few practices, he approached me and said, "Kevy, I want you to be the captain of my soccer team." Well, this was a huge deal to me because, as I told you, I'm the son of a coach. Being captain's a big deal. I always wanted to be captain of all teams I played on. And so I was about to say yes, and he said, "Before you answer, I need you to understand something. If you're going to be the captain of my team, I need you to come to practice early, and I need you to stay late. Help me set up the fields, then help me take down the fields. So take down the nets, collect the soccer balls, cones, whatever else we're using that day." And as I had all the freedom I needed, I said, of course, no problem, and I happily accepted. And thereafter, Randy and I fell into this rhythm. And the rhythm that we fell into was, I would come to practice early, we would set up our field, we would have soccer practice would end, all the parents would come to that middle school parking lot, pick up their kiddos, and then it would just be Randy and me. And we would spend time together, loading up his car with the soccer balls and the nets and all that, and then we'd climb into his car and we would talk. And most of my memories of Randy come from inside that car. And a lot of gross stuff happened inside that car. I used to sit on his lap, even though there was a perfectly good empty seat next to him. And I don't know why, how that started. Was it his idea, my idea? I don't remember. But I do know that I was always on his lap. So I was physically very close to him. And his hands would sort of be everywhere. And he used to kiss me in a way that no one had ever kissed me before. And I remember telling him, this is gross. And he said, Kevy, this is the way that people who love each other show it. And you love me, right? I don't have a really long amount of time with you this morning, but I give you that very lengthy introduction to who Randy was to me, because when he posed that question, the answer was really obvious to me. I did. I loved him. You heard from the video, the statistics show that 90% of our kiddos who are sexually abused know, trust, and love the people that hurt them. And so Randy to me was not my boogeyman. He wasn't the thing of nightmares, at least as I understood nightmares then. Randy graduated very quickly from our time together, from being my coach to being my friend to being my very best friend in the world. Because when I would sit in his car and I would tell him about the problems in our house, tell him about how my parents were treating each other and the rest of us, he was there to listen to me. Unbeknownst to me at 9, I didn't realize what his real motives were and the reason he cared to listen to me. But as I understood him, who he was to me is who many of the abusers are to the kids in this parish. Somebody they know, they love, and trust. And so I went with it. And most of our time together was inside that car after practice. It felt like we spent hours in that car. I know now as a grown-up that would have been impossible, but it was significant moments for me. It wasn't the only time we spent together. Besides after practice, I also walked to school. So I told you that the middle school was sort of across the street and in one direction, and the opposite direction was my elementary school. That's where I would walk to school every day. And at the end of school, I would walk home, and oftentimes Randy would be parked on my street. And so I would be excited to see my friend and hop in his car, and we would go do something. Go get pizza or ice cream, go hit golf balls, do something. And so that's kind of my relationship with Randy. I played soccer for him for 2 seasons, and I was with him a lot. And about halfway through the second season, the YMCA had a sleepover for all the boys who played soccer for the YMCA and their dads. And the idea was they'd take them into the gymnasium. Gym was about frankly, this size of this room. But we'd go to the YMCA, we'd have full run of the place. So not only we'd have the gym with basketball courts, they had tennis courts, an indoor soccer field, racquetball courts, a pool. They had great things. And so the idea was we'd spend our time there. Well, my dad couldn't go, because I went home to tell him about this great event, and he said, I can't go. He had to coach a hockey tournament that weekend. And I was very disappointed. And I told Randy about my disappointment, and not surprisingly, Randy had a plan. He said, Kevy, why don't you and I go together? I'll tell them I'm your uncle. That way you get to go and I get to go. And I thought this was a great plan, and I told him, this is a great idea, and I'll go tell my dad. And he said, don't do that. Don't do that. Let's you and I tell him together. And I remember in real time thinking what a weird request that was, because I knew my dad had met Randy at this point. He'd come to a bunch of my games. And I knew that he knew Randy well enough to know that we were friends. But what I realized much later is the manipulation in that moment. And I think no matter what field you're in, no matter what work you've done, the fact that you're here means you have some knowledge of the abuse of our kids. And probably most of you have heard of this phrase of grooming. Grooming is this notion of how children get to trust the people that abuse them. The abusers use a variety of tactics to manipulate our kids into trusting them. Well, grooming takes place not only on the level of the abuser to the child, but oftentimes the abuser to everyone surrounding the child, typically the family, the friends, that kind of thing. And I believe Randy was learning from all of the things we talked about in his car, and he used what he knew to manipulate my dad in real time to get my dad to say yes to allowing me to go with Randy to the sleepover at the YMCA. And my dad did say yes. He trusted Randy. Randy's work in manipulating me and manipulating my family paid off, that my dad trusted him so much that he said, sure, Kevy can go with you. And so I went to the YMCA that night, and we had run of the place, and me and my teammates had a good old time. And then at some point, I think we ordered pizzas and ate pizzas in the gym, and at some point it was time for lights to go out and for us all to have the sleepover part of the YMCA sleepover. So we all got out our sleeping bags. And as I pulled mine out, Randy said, Kevy, don't do that. Don't do that. Why don't you come in my sleeping bag? Stay with me. Now, it seems like a weird request, right? But at that age, I had spent so much time physically close to Randy, all that time in his car, sitting on his lap, that being that close to him was not an unusual thing for me. So I said yes. And I climbed into his sleeping bag, and we talked. And I don't know what we talked about, and the lights went out, and presumably everybody else slept or tried to sleep. And at some point, I turned my back to Randy. And for the next 8 hours of my life, my best friend in the whole world, the first friend I ever really made on my own, sexually assaulted me in a room full of about 100 people. And I said nothing. And I did nothing. And you're good people, and you care about kids, and there's people in this audience who want to reach out to me and say, Kevy, you were 9 years old in a dark room with someone who wasn't your family. What were you supposed to do? And you're right. You're 100% right. It's absolutely not my fault. But when it's you, and it happens to you, and you say nothing, and you do nothing, it is a burden that you carry. And there are kids who come to Hope House pulling the door handle for the first time that are carrying that burden with them. And if we can be honest with each other for a minute, if we can just put aside the sort of political correctness of the world and just say that it's harder for our male victims to have said nothing and done nothing in some ways. We live in a culture that teaches them to be tough and never to be victimized and to fight. I had no fight in me that day, none. And so I said nothing, and I did nothing. And I don't know if you ever had this experience where you've sort of been sleeping with someone and you can sort of feel them crying, not really hear them crying so much, but sort of feel them crying, maybe based on the way the bed moves, or in this case, the way the sleeping bag moves. Well, I had that feeling at some point in the night. And I turned to look at Randy for the first time, and it seemed to me like he was crying. And I said, what's wrong? And he said, I'm so sorry, Kevy, I'm so sorry. But you look just like him. And I said, I look just like who? And he said, my son. And then he told me, my best friend told me, for the first time, that he was a dad of a child who was 2 years old when he died, and apparently that child looked just like me. And so despite everything that had happened inside that car, despite everything that was happening in real time in that room, despite all of it, the confusion, the hurt, all of it, when my best friend told me about his loss, my heart broke for my friend. And so what do you think sensitive 9-year-old Kevin said to Randy when he said, I'm so sorry, Kevy. I'm so sorry. It's okay. I told the man who sexually assaulted me that it was okay. I blessed it. I did that. And there are kids who come to Hope House burdened with the idea that they blessed it too, that they said it was okay. And it is a burden that is even harder to lift than to have said nothing and done nothing. Now, he didn't have a child who died. He didn't have a child who looked at me. He wasn't even married. He wasn't anything I thought he was. but I had no way to know that. And so I told him it was okay. And that night went on, and mercifully at some point the lights came on and everyone gathered their sleeping bags and we were going to walk out. And my dad, and I don't really know why, he and I don't, this isn't his favorite topic to talk about, so he came into the gym to get me. And I don't know why he couldn't spend the night, it was probably hockey stuff, but he came in to get me, and I'll never forget it because I was standing next to Randy, and my old man came in and he said, "Did you have fun, buddy?" And I promise you, the next words in my mouth, it felt like it was right here, was, "Do you know what this son of a just did to me?" I swore a lot, even as a 9-year-old. It's kind of part of my charm. But I didn't say that. I remembered what Randy had told me during the night. He said, "Kevin, you know you can't tell anybody about this, right? You know how mad your father will be at you. You know how selfish you will sound. And you know how your folks don't need this right now." And that sounds crazy. I understand. And I hear, and you heard in the video, that I've met kiddos over and over who have been threatened with physical violence. They've been threatened with having their images posted on the internet for all to see. They've been threatened with financial harm to their family. They've been threatened with things that feel more sensitive than what I was threatened with. But 9-year-old me, the worst thing I could do was disappoint my dad. And Randy, again, had been learning from all the times that I sat on his lap and told him about my family. He had been learning about my dad, who is a lovely man, but my dad hates conflict, and my dad hates selfishness. Like with the passion of 1,000 men, my dad hates selfishness. And so when he told me that my dad might view me as selfish for bringing my problems and making it everyone's problem, it worked. And I kept my mouth shut, and I said nothing again. But I knew, and I don't understand why, but I'm grateful for it, I knew that that night, despite everything that had happened in the car, despite everything that had happened up to that point, that night was different. That night was the line in the sand for me where I said, never again, I'm done. I couldn't, I didn't want to be with Randy anymore. Now, unfortunately, we were halfway through a soccer season. As the son of a coach, you don't get to quit a sport halfway through a season. Quitting at halftime is reserved for Detroit Lions defensive backs. So I couldn't do that. So I had to keep going, but eventually soccer ended. But I wasn't out of the woods just yet. Because I also was still going to school. And so I would walk home from school and I would see Randy and he'd be parked on my street and he'd talk to me. But eventually I was able to pull away from him because school ended as well. I quit soccer at the end of that season. I came to my father and said, "Dad, I don't want to play soccer anymore. I want to play football." And I love my dad. But dude should have had some follow-up questions, right? I'm built like a fire hydrant. He's like, "What's your role going to be in this game? Are you going to be the ball? What is the plan for you, my son?" But because I left soccer and because school had ended, time had passed, and I had separated myself from Randy, and so life kind of went on. And in that fall, so I played for Randy for fall and spring. Spring was the sleepover. I went through the summer into the fall, and one day I'm riding my bike home, and I take a shortcut from a friend's house. I take a shortcut through that middle school, and I decide to go through the middle school parking lot. And to go through the middle school parking lot, in order to see it, you're sort of blocked by the school and the route that I was taking, and so I couldn't actually see the parking lot until I was in it. So I cleared the building of the school. I'm riding my bike, and I get into the parking lot, and there's one car in that parking lot. And it's the same car I had spent all that time with Randy. And I had been looking for it, and I was fearful that I'd find it, but I was taking a shortcut home. I had otherwise tried to avoid that middle school, but that day I didn't, and I should have, because I saw him again. And as soon as I cleared the building, it felt like he was waiting for me, which is an impossibility. But I could hear his voice, "Kevy, come here, Kevy, come here, Kevy, come here." And I was staring at my feet. As soon as I saw his car, I looked down at my feet, and my heart was racing, and I was pedaling my little feet, and I knew where his car was based on what I had seen and what I could hear from him, and I pedaled towards him. And as I got close and my heart was racing, I sort of stepped down off my bike, off the pedals of my bike, and I looked up, and there was Randy, and there was another little boy sitting on his lap. And I'd love to tell you the compassion that I had for that kid. But my mind was so messed up that a different emotion, a much more shameful emotion came over me. I was jealous of that kid. Not jealous because I wanted to be him, don't misunderstand me, I didn't. But jealous because I was so easily replaced. How nothing did I feel when I was trying to avoid Randy, quitting sports, worried all the time, and he is just on to the next one. And as I sat outside that car and talked with Randy and that boy, I don't know his name and I don't know what we talked about, but I remember riding my bike home and it was cold. And I remember cold tears coming down my cheeks. And this would be the amazing moment, the beautiful moment where I burst through the doors of my house and say, Mom, Dad, there's a boy in trouble and he needs our help. But once again, I said nothing. And I did nothing. I knew what was coming for that boy. And I said nothing again. And there are kids that come to Hope House, and when they get there, they are burdened with a truth that is hard to shake. It's a truth that came to me much later in life, but it is a burden that is impossible to carry. My silence that day helped Randy hurt that boy. And there are kids who come to Hope House who know that their silence, their delay in disclosure, helped the person that hurt them hurt somebody else. And it's a burden that's impossible to carry. Yet every day, kids come to Hope House carrying that burden. Life went on from there, and I fast forward through pieces of the story until my folks' divorce became final. I moved with my dad. Everyone else in my family split up. My brother, my sister, closest in age, went to live with my mother. My brother moved to Canada to play junior hockey, which I can translate for you if you don't speak hockey. My brother moved to Canada to get in fistfights and drink beer, and he was wildly successful on both fronts. And then my oldest sister went to a half-baked institution in East Lansing, Michigan, where dreams go to die, called Michigan State University. Pray for her soul. And I lived with my dad, and life went on. And one day, and no one knew my secret, and a couple of years went by, and one day I was home watching television, a show called Different Strokes, if anybody is as old as I am to remember that show. There was an episode about childhood sexual abuse, and to put a finer point on it, childhood sexual abuse involving boys. And I didn't know that was a thing that happened to other kids. I didn't know. And I watched that episode, and I cried hard. But my dad was supposed to be at the rink, and the damnedest thing happened. Right after that show ended, and I'm in a puddle of my own tears, and I'm a mess. The door handle turns, and my old man walks in. He forgot his skates. It's like the only thing you can't forget. And he came in and found me, and that's the day that I disclosed. I had no moment of bravery. I didn't say enough is enough. I watched a TV show, and my dad forgot his skates. And I'm stopping here at this moment. Actually, let me give you one more moment. My dad worked for Ford for 33 years. He's a business guy. Didn't know a thing about childhood sexual abuse, but he handled it like a champ. And I told him everything that happened to me, and we took a number of steps after that. But I want to stop at this moment to tell you that this is a sort of fork in the road. And there's a difference between up to this moment, my story is the same as all kinds of kids that come to Hope House here and to come to CACs, Child Advocacy Centers all around the country. My story is the same. But because of people like you, the road forks from my story to these kids' story. Because what happened after, and I don't have time to tell you, is a set of teenage years and early 20s and 30s and on, of pretty lousy life for me. The fallout was pretty severe, from addictions to substance abuse to terrible behavior to self-hatred to suicidal ideation. The path that I walked was excruciating, and I was alone. But that fork in the road moment means that if 9-year-old Kevin were here in this community and it happened the same way, he would get to walk through the doors at Hope House. and you would have a totally different path. I'm not going to sugarcoat things for you. It's not rainbows and kittens. It's not all easy, but it's different, and it's not as alone. What these offenders do is they put myself and my fellow survivors in a valley of darkness. And for the longest time, that path through that valley, you walked alone, and some of us came out, and some of us didn't. But because of places like Hope House, it doesn't have to be that way. So there are two other groups of people in this room besides survivors. I told you what it was like to walk in to the doors and how it's that valley of darkness. But there are people in this room who serve our kids every day. Our friends in law enforcement, prosecutors, child protective service workers, people who work at schools, the people at Hope House every day who open those doors and welcome those kiddos. There are volunteers, there are child forensic interviewers, there are therapists. There is an army of people dedicated to get hope and justice and recovery and healing for our kiddos. There's an army. And if you're one of those people in this room today, let me just say thank you for 9-year-old Kevin and the millions of 9-year-old Kevins out there. Thank you. You have gifts, you have talents, and you give those to these kids. You go into the darkest corners of the human condition and you try to help. And I love you for it. I mean it. I really do. You could do anything, and you choose to do this. And if you notice that I'm looking in the back, it's because that's how these things work. You guys are probably at back tables. And so I'm grateful for you, and I'm grateful that you're here. I never miss a chance to challenge my friends who do this work as well, because we all could use the challenge one day. I ask that you continue to try to be as brave as every kid that walks through that door and has the guts to tell you what happened to them. Every kid, every time. There's another group of people here today, and if you don't do that work, I still thank you because you're here today, and those are the people who support financially Hope House. And I admire you because if I went down to downtown New Orleans, downtown Detroit, where I'm from, anywhere else, if I go downtown New Orleans and I pulled 100 people and I said to them, are you for child abuse or are you against child abuse? We go 100 for 100, I hope. I'm saying, of course, I'm against child abuse. And if I said, could I just push you one step further and say, would you be willing to do something to help our kiddos who face child abuse? And I asked those same 100 people that question. I think I'd go 100 for 100 again and say, of course I would. I would do something. I would step in and I would take action to help our kids. But if I was able to examine the content of their heart, I think I'd be disappointed. Because the best reflection of a person's heart can be found in their calendar and in their checkbook. You want to know what someone's about? Don't give them a poll to ask them if they're for or against child abuse. Ask to look at their calendar and their checkbook. You'll find out what matters to them. And if I looked at those same 100 people's calendars and checkbooks, I'd probably be disappointed, but not you. The reflection of your heart can be found here today. The fact that you are here on a Wednesday morning. You probably have busy days, you have jobs to get to, kiddos to get to, things to do. And you've said, nope, today's different. Today I'm coming and I'm spending my time to understand more about the kids in my community and what they face. And then you have an opportunity to donate today. And I know many of you will, and I'm grateful for you for that. Because the place runs on your generosity, and it runs on the fact that you're willing to say, not only do I care about child abuse, but my heart shows based on my time and my finances, and I'm grateful for you for that. And if I can borrow back to my analogy, while they put us, the offenders put us in the darkest valleys and ask us to walk through there, for generations we walked alone. I walked alone. But because of people who do the work, like the people at Hope House, I'm not alone anymore. Because there's an army of people there to walk with us, to walk with the kids. And not only do they walk with the kids, but because of you, the people who donate and provide the resources for us who do this work, you light up that valley. It's not dark anymore. You provide the flashlights. You provide huge lights. The valley doesn't go away, But now our kiddos in this community walk with someone, and they walk in darkness no more. So my ask of you this morning is to shine the light. When you provide their resources, that's what you're doing. You're shining a light. So you shine a light for that little girl who trusted somebody online, who got tricked, and whose images are now plastered all over the world. You shine a light for her. You shine a light for that little boy that has to hide inside of his own house because dad got drunk again and wants to thump somebody. You shine a light from him. And you shine a light for every little 9-year-old soccer player from a nothing town who just wanted a friend and got manipulated and abused. You shine a light for that kid. And if you'll indulge me, I just have 2 things before I take my seat. I'm going to share with you 2 of my own personal beliefs, so I appreciate you indulge me. One is that I believe that I'm standing here before you because of God's grace alone. I don't get here without him. He delivered me to this moment. The second thing is I don't believe in coincidences. I don't believe in like cosmic happenstance. That's just not my thing. I don't buy it. And let's just say that I'm right about both of those things. That it's God's grace that brings me here and that I'm here on purpose. If I'm right, then my suggestion to you is that by being here and helping Hope House, you have the opportunity to be no less than the face of God's grace to the kids in this community. And if there's something better than that, I haven't found it. Thank you guys very much for having me. I really appreciate it.